Don't worry, your earphones or speaker system works just fine. The recording you just heard is from CCTV footage outside the home of Sam Borsinger. It's one of the few recordings to emerge from Cotsworth Rise, the quiet Kentish countryside village that, according to the internet, and just like the majority of other CCTV footage, no longer seems to exist. My name is Felix Purdit, and I'm a journalist who's about to explain exactly what happened that night, on many, many other nights in Cotsworth Rise, and what I saw when I went there. I've compiled interviews, online messages, and passing comments caught in the chaos of the moments you'll hear about. But in my honest opinion, very little can prepare you for the horrifying truth of what really happened in Cotsworth Rise. What happened there, and to the people who lived there. This is their story. My investigation began in July 2021, except at the very beginning it wasn't quite the same research. The UK was finally emerging from the government's COVID restrictions. Half the country was celebrating a quote-unquote Freedom Day, while the other half cringed at the thought of it. Needless to say, I had more than a reasonable share of concerns plaguing my mind. As a freelance journalist, I'd written musings on Megxit, network rail station toilet charges, and how the EU were more receptive to our government's Brexit extension requests than most universities are for students who've genuinely suffered Wi-Fi outages. What I needed now, though, was a new story, and urgently. Furlough had ended, and it was time for freelance Felix to whack on his warface again. I needed a story that was culturally relevant and hooked on the zeitgeist. So, I thought carefully about what myself, a relatively young and once outgoing man of the era, might be interested in. The main issue was, there was an emphasis on the once outgoing. Lockdown was about to end, but even then, the idea of escaping the confines of my flat into crowds upon crowds of people just made me feel anxious. In fact, not just anxious, the thought of it induced sweat. Our understanding of the epidemiological universe had changed forever, and returning back to quote-unquote normal wasn't something I felt ready for just yet. And, after failing to find my front door keys one day and thinking what the cost of smashing my front door down would be, I decided on the chosen story. How the youth of lockdown snuck out of their confinements. All I needed now were my glorious subjects. I took to Twitter and sent out an open invitation, inviting anyone under the age of 30 to contribute their story anonymously. The ambition? For half a dozen exciting, inspirational voices to spark enough interest from the people who'd pay the bills. Around 24 hours later, and to my somewhat surprise, I got my first response. @Jesse the Hitchcock wrote, "Hey there, I snuck out of lockdown to shoot a zombie film. If you keep my name anonymous, I'll tell you everything." Great, I thought, and messaged them back with my phone number so we could discuss the details.
So, yeah, about the first week into lockdown, and obviously myself, I still need to shoot some establishing shots for London, because, it's obviously going to be really hard to shoot famous parts of London that already look like a zombie apocalypse. So literally, I saw those pictures of Oxford Circus completely shut down, and I just took my chances. I came with the equipment, police stopped us, I could have just said we're filming for work. So once we were there, first thing in the morning, I got the shots.
Fascinating. And you don't feel any more discomfort now that lockdown's lifted than you felt back then?
No, none that I can think of. I mean, I'm still going to wear a mask, but it's not like I can just think and act sensibly.
I thanked him and asked if there was anyone else he could refer me to for an interview. He said he'd give it some good thought and let me know. Terrific. One pretty decent story down, just 5 more till showtime. A day later, I got a call back from @Jesse the Hitchcock.
So there's this friend of a friend. She's a student living in Whitechapel. I heard from a friend she's got so homesick from around the middle of the first lockdown, she just snuck out and escaped back home to Kent.
Oh, really? What's her name, if I may ask? And do you know where in Kent?
Rachel Adler, her family live in this tiny little village called Cotsworth Rise near Ashford. Apparently I heard her stepdad was a bit of a COVID septic, so she was a bit apprehensive, but she made it back somehow.
This is great, thanks so much. I searched Rachel on Facebook and found her profile relatively quickly. Rachel Adler from Cotsworth Rise. Thankfully, she'd chosen to include her village name in the Where Do You Live section. I was keen to keep the momentum going and ask about her plans to evade prosecution in the middle of the first lockdown, and whether she was successful or not. However, when I clicked on her name, I found it was an open profile. I could see literally all her activity, but, to my surprise, her last entry was from the 6th of May 2020. That's fine, I remember thinking. Chances are she may still use Facebook, she just doesn't post anymore. I sent her a message, saying, "Hi Rachel, my name's Felix, and I'm a freelance journalist collecting stories of people with interesting lockdown breakout stories. Hope you don't mind me messaging you like this, but an anonymous friend told me you were thinking of escaping London and heading back to your home in Cotsworth Rise. I was wondering if I could please ask you a few quick questions about that. You'll remain 100% anonymous, of course. I'm keeping her name in this for reasons I'll disclose later in the series." To my honest surprise, she replied in a matter of minutes. She wrote, "Hi Felix, thanks for getting in touch. If I'm kept anonymous, then sure, although I have to admit the journey was absurdly smooth and dull. I highly doubt this would be of any interest to your readers." I told her I was keen to hear it regardless. A lead online was better for me than a lead outdoors, and if I could prize just one fascinating detail out of her story, the article would be richer for it. I asked her how she was feeling at this stage of lockdown being lifted, politely revealing that I'd heard her stepfather was a COVID skeptic. She responded with, "Amazing! I've honestly never felt happier or safer. Life is so much better right now." I took my questions into more detail, asking about her journey, how she carried it out, and how she avoided fines or prosecution. Her answers were as simple as she'd implied. She'd created an alibi that she was a key worker, hopped on a train, and her parents had picked her up from the station just before midnight. What was surprising was how she answered all of these with a tone of incredible exuberance. I'll admit, I found this more encouraging than suspicious. If Rachel had mingled with the outside world again and was so elated at having done so, then so could I. I asked if we could continue this conversation over the phone, explaining it'd be easier for me to ask more complex questions and get a clearer understanding of her tone and attitude. However, Rachel then replied with, "I'm so sorry, but my phone's in for repair at the moment." I asked if she had a house phone I could try instead. She said this was also broken and being fixed presently. We agreed to continue the conversation over Facebook Messenger tomorrow. When we left it at that, my attention found itself on Rachel's profile page. I scrolled down to her last post from May 2020. This was when things started to get more suspicious. Her last post was a status on her younger brother's condition. He'd been diagnosed with thyroid cancer in October 2019, and from the detail in her post, she was keeping the public updated on his current condition. And yet, she'd posted nothing since. If she was eager to keep friends and family notified of his progressing condition, then why hadn't she posted in a year and a half? But oh well. Her positive tone implied all was working out well in her family, and you know what? Maybe she just wanted to keep the matter private. I messaged her back the next day, but there was no reply. A day later, I politely followed up, gently letting her know that I was working towards a deadline and if we could please arrange a time that suited her best. A few more days went by, and any new leads had virtually no success. I opened our message tab and again found she hadn't opened it. I tried clicking on her profile to see if she'd posted any new statuses, and then, in my idiocy, I sneezed. At that moment my hand jolted and accidentally clicked the call button. I cringed, immediately moving to hang up, but all of a sudden, she answered. And then I saw it. What lay on the other side of the screen. There were no lights other than the thin blue beam emanating from her screen. Her laptop was on the floor of what I could only presume was her bedroom. Rachel herself was nowhere to be seen. I thought about explaining the call was an accident when I suddenly saw something move. It wasn't clear. The whole room was doused in thick darkness, but in the middle of the screen, a shape of some sort shifted. And then it happened again. In the midst of the void, the faint outline of a silhouette slid forward, no, crawled forward, closer to the camera. I should have called out, but curiosity transfixed my eyes to the screen. And then, reaching the edge of the blue light but not coming too close to light it up completely, was the murky silhouette of a hand. Someone was there, Rachel or someone else, on all fours just out of sight. I asked if it was Rachel. The silhouette stopped. Now, getting desperate to see if it was her or not, I peered in closer. What I could now make out was a face. It was still outside the periphery of blue light, so I couldn't discern any features, but it was definitely there. The face, arms, and hands of someone tactically crawling on all fours towards the webcam. I leaned in closer. 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 It was lunging at me. I saw a rapid flailing of arms lash out at the camera, and then the call ended. What was that? Was that Rachel? Shocked and concerned, I started messaging Jessie, explaining what had happened, and a vibrating began to make my table tremble. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered it. Hello?
I'm sorry, I found your number online, but please listen to me. This is Rachel Adler, and I need you to call the police to Cotsworth Rise. I don't know if it's awake, but it's heard my voice now, so if you call again and I answer, it's not me. It's not me. Oh, God. Please just call the police.
She hung up. Horrified and chaotically processing everything, I immediately called the police. I recorded the call, but, under UK law, I needed permission from the police to release it publicly. For a number of reasons, they didn't grant it. I told them everything, and they said they'd send officers to her address immediately. I then went back to the recording of her call and replayed it. At that point, I noticed something I hadn't caught before.
Please just call the police.
And again.
Please just call the police.
Did you hear it? In the background, but likely in the same room as Rachel, was a wheezing sound. My Facebook tab dinged, and I immediately jumped over to it. It was Rachel. Her message read, "Hey, so sorry about that. It was my brother, I swear. Ever since his thyroid cancer diagnosis, he's been living life like there's no tomorrow. And he's a prankster, so you know what that means. He's got a recording from a thriller we made last year, saw we'd been talking, and just played it down the phone to you." I told her I needed more serious proof she was okay. 20 seconds passed, and then a photo of her appeared. There she was, smiling in her bedroom. Everything about it seemed real. But either way, the police were coming. I thanked her, but decided to examine the photo again. Something then caught my eye. In the corner behind her was a TV displaying an interview with Michael Gove. The Minister for the Cabinet Office was interviewed fairly regularly, so I thought little of it. But then I enlarged the photo and reread the headline beneath it. It said that Boris Johnson had missed 5 Cobra meetings. News that broke in April 2020. My phone buzzed again, and I immediately answered. It was the police. An officer had been to Rachel's house, and apparently everything was perfectly normal. No disturbances, no signs of anything unusual whatsoever. That was fast, I remember thinking. Unless an officer was already in the area, that was very, very fast. I had every reason to trust the police, but, still trapped in my flat and desperate not to leave, the idea that it had all been an elaborate prank didn't sit well with me. What about the video before? It was definitely her voice, and it certainly didn't sound like a recording. I still couldn't bring myself to leave, so I researched Cotsworth Rise to see if anyone locally knew more than myself or the police did, and maybe if they could check in on her too. I typed in Cotsworth Rise, Ashford, and there it was, shrouded in the depths of Coldbridge Wood, this one red arrow. I clicked on Street View, but could only see a woodland path dipping between two hills. There was no street view of the village itself. This location can be found on Google Maps. I tried Wikipedia, but nope, nothing. I scoured through Google, but again, absolutely nothing. It was as if this little village had slipped through the encyclopedic cracks of the internet and vanished into complete anonymity. But then, I found something. A YouTube video titled "Creepy Car at Night with No Headlights or Number Plates Caught on Camera." Its location? Cotsworth Rise. I opened the video, and there it was. Edging through the darkness. It barely drove, instead almost rolling down the lane with a barely audible hum. One thing was clear. They'd gone to great detail and great danger to ensure that not a single resident nearby knew they were there. Complete anonymity in the night. The video quality wasn't exactly HD, but it was enough to tell the number plate was covered. This video can be found on YouTube. Suddenly, and inexplicably, the car seemed weirdly familiar. I was reaching around in my brain, trying to figure out exactly what and why it was recognizable. And then it struck me. I whipped open Facebook and scoured through any and every profile I'd made contact with over the past few days. My memory jogged me further, and I clicked on Rachel's profile. There it was. In her cover photo was Rachel standing triumphantly in front of her new Mini. I dashed back to the video momentarily to check it again. Yep, even in the darkness and with the blurred video quality, the chances of it being the same one seemed very, very high. I checked the description, which read, "So I live in Egerton near Ashford, Kent, and since June 2020, I haven't seen anyone drive in or out of the next village, Cotsworth Rise. They normally use our village as a cut-through, in daylight. The only times I've seen anyone drive out of there is at night, but when they do, they always have their headlights and number plates covered and drive extremely slowly, like they don't want anyone to know they're there. This video is just one example, but it happens a lot. Weird, right? Or am I just being paranoid?" I didn't want to accept it was coming to it, but maybe that time had come. I wanted to crawl under my sheets and remind myself that the police had been, gone, and everything was just a huge misunderstanding. But from this, and the overthinker in me, I still didn't believe it. Was I the one who'd have to travel to Cotsworth Rise and investigate myself? From a distance, of course, but still investigating nonetheless. There was no information on anyone else from the neighbouring villages, and I couldn't pay anyone to investigate for me. And then I realised, if I stay in a car, I can escape whenever I need to. No unavoidable conversations, and I'd be out of there in a flash if I needed to. So that's what I did. I borrowed my parents' car and drove down to Cotsworth Rise. It was an hour and a half's drive, but I arrived at Egerton at around 9 p.m. And then I waited. It was a long, cold hour sitting in the car on the edge of the heath, and it was quiet. Strangely, impossibly quiet. And then, after an hour, I saw it. Crawling along the large winding lane opposite the heath was Rachel's car. I gently reversed out of my space, found my way onto the road it was halfway down, and followed from a distance. There was a good 60 meters between us, and even if they spotted me, I was just another local resident minding my own business. After roughly 5 minutes, I turned a corner, but the car had vanished. Getting anxious, I peered around the dip in the hill where we were, and then noticed it. That unmarked dirt road trailing off to the right that led up into the trees. That was where Cotsworth Rise was. I drove onto the path and remembered the night sky submerging under the tree cover. 2 minutes later, the first set of houses loomed out of the darkness. If it hadn't been for my headlights, I wouldn't have seen them. All their lights were off, and had it not been for their relatively well-kept condition, they could have been abandoned. I parked on the side of the dirt road. There was more to this hidden little village, of course, but this was as far as I could bring myself to go for now. Rachel's car, however, was still nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, I heard that sound again, echoing from somewhere out there in the blackness. Except this time, there was more of them. I couldn't tell how many of them there were, but there were lots, and they all floated out of the darkness as if they were running towards me. My phone started ringing. It was Rachel. I answered it. Rachel?
Felix, quickly, drive to my house. I'm 6 houses down. Just get inside, quickly.
Rachel, what's that sound? What is that?
I don't know, but if you drive to my house, we can solve this. You just need to get inside.
A thought then came to mind. How can she see me? Is she outside too? There were only 3 houses in sight, and if she was 6 houses in, then she must be much, much further down the dirt road. Rachel, are you... I snapped my head to the right and saw a policeman slamming his fist into my window.
Did you use the Wi-Fi?
I don't remember replying, just shaking my head, terrified.
Good. Whatever you do, make sure you drive a good mile away before sticking your sat-nav on. Now go!
Felix, are you coming?
That's not Rachel! Listen to me. That's not Rachel. Hang up, turn around and leave.
I remember gawking at him for a long moment.
Do I need to fine you for police obstruction?
I dropped my phone onto the seat beside me, the call still continuing. Before I'd even spun the car around, the policeman had vanished.
Felix? Felix? Felix, what are you doing? Where are you going? Felix?
I could have turned back. I could have pleaded with that policeman, not knowing what I'd be pleading for, but I didn't. There were so many decisions I could have made then, and plenty more I made from that moment on that I hope God at least tries to understand. As I slowed down and entered the main road back towards Egerton, I glanced down at my phone. Rachel, or according to that policeman, whoever was imitating Rachel, had hung up. In the top left corner, the words "no service" became 4G again. My journey into understanding what that truly meant, who that had really been, and what was currently taking place inside Cotsworth Rise began that night.